recommend it to everyone. It's just a couple of pages of every monarch, starting with, I think, same again, Alfred the Great. That's a great way to start. Having a look at, no, it starts with Edgar. Anyway, hello. Welcome to another essay discussion. Today we're going to be taking a look at the Myth of Absolutism, written by Nicolas
Henshall or Henshall. Yes. I've seen it spelt differently in two different places, which is very odd. But however it's spelled.
Yes, and I think at the end of it, I'll make sure that I link the PDF. But highly recommended. Just before we start off, I'd say that anyone interested in absolutism should give it a read. I found it very informative, not for any specific context, but historiography for me has become very interesting, especially in the times that we're living through. And so any kind of new perspective on how we interpret history is always nice to come across. Do you want to give a brief overview of what the essay is about, Rupert?
Sure. So the primary thrust of the article is that our interpretation of absolutism of the Ancien regime pre-French Revolution is very skewed in France particularly, but also elsewhere, because the prerogatives and powers that were held by the king were relatively unchanged. But over the course of time, the reason that there seems to be so much change taking place is because at various points, particularly during regencies, there would be kings that were either unable to exercise their powers or their prerogatives, or had them, delegated away to some council or some other body, and then gradually over time they would have to kind of win those back over time. The reason for the discrepancy between how we view absolutism and how it sort of more realistically was because a lot of the histories that were being written about the period and about the sort of politics of the period in particular were written almost in hindsight in a sort of 19th century perspective, where they had a very different experience of monarchical power in the sort of more Metternich era monarchies, where there was a much greater focus on centralized monarchies that had their secret police, high degrees of regulation of the press, a lot of control over speech, and large bureaucracies that could exercise power much more centrally than anything prior to the French Revolution ever could. So what that means is that when you're looking back, you perceive things to be much more centrally focused. So particularly under the reign of someone like Louis XIV, and they actually were, whereas Louis XIV himself had to be doing things in much more of a negotiating fashion, and he had to rely on a lot of goodwill from more local power holders, like I think it was there was a particular count that was mentioned down in Provence, who was not an official in the way that we would recognize it if we're looking purely at the systems, but he was someone who could rally a lot of local support for anything that that Louis wanted to do, because he was kind of more of a socialite and local dignitary in a more informal sense. And I think therefore looking at those kinds of relationships becomes a lot more important for how you view the period.
Was that Francois de Castellane? Was it something?
Yes, that sounds right.
Yeah. That was a good overview. It's basically how everything post Enlightenment we're looking back retrospectively as being absolutism, but the entire concept of absolutism, of absolute monarchy does not match with absolutism. I think one of the big points of the essay is to really try and drive home the fact that absolute monarchy, if you're ever going to use that term, which even that should be questionable as whether or not we just drop it altogether, there's a massive delineation between what we consider absolute monarchy and absolutism. And I think one of the major differences is the embracing bureaucracy as an absolutist state or government or monarchy is a necessity. but as you say, negotiation and more cooperative means are essential when it comes to an absolute monarch.
Yes. But there's a number of other facets of it as well, and this is where some other thinkers have to come in, I suppose, because something that Filmer points out, Robert Filmer, is that parliaments are not necessarily in opposition to royal power as much as they are. So historically, particularly in the period that we're talking about, they are in some sense an extension of it, because they are brought together at his will, and so quite often there would be a very positive and constructive relationship between a king and the various parliaments, because they would enable a degree of, so not only would they allow an access to expertise and deliberation and basically ideas for policy, but they would also allow much more legitimacy when the king is approaching areas of areas such as taxation, where there would be much more sort of resistance, and there'd be much more of a perception of the citizens being much more defensive, essentially, because what people do with their own property is much more of a closely guarded right traditionally than something like foreign policy. People aren't so worried about what happens at the foreign policy level, and so that's always been something that's been accepted as a royal prerogative power. But then when you get down to more of the nitty gritty about how people live their lives on the more individual scale, then things get a lot more contentious, and so you need a parliament to be able to legitimately enter that realm and then get agreement on those matters. And it seems we've lost Albion temporarily. So,
well, then I have to take over for a while, I guess. The way you describe it basically is that it feels like the king had a role like a negotiation position with other nations. So there was a certain strength in numbers when you would band together and have one guy negotiate with the other nations, while all internal stuff you just do everything individually. That was the more common arrangement. While the view that has been created after the French Revolution was that the king was a tyrant, and that basically nothing could happen without his consent and his direct consent, and that therefore he was evil and had to be removed.
Am I audible now?
Yes, you're back.
Yep. Okay.
There's also a certain irony there, though, in that a lot of the people who were very early patrons of the sort of Enlightenment ideas, a lot of the kings and nobles who come to mind when you would talk about something like an enlightened despot, those are the people who are really bypassing this whole traditional system and just forcing through their own will, potentially at the point of a bayonet, but it's in favor of liberal ideas, which is not part of this equation usually.
Yeah, so the myth of absolutism is that it's being used as a counter-narrative to push forward why the Church of Reason should be used, or why constitutional monarchy or anything aside from absolute monarchy should be in place as opposed to absolute monarchy. But obviously, the great irony is the fact that the myth of absolutism is being used as a narrative to fight against what they are actually pushing for. So what they describe as an absolute monarchy in this myth is actually what they're aiming for themselves.
Right, and that comes across in a lot of the early conflicts over the Constitution of France, and well, even earlier than that, the Constitution of England. That the negation of the Constitution is what has sort of created this conflict in the first place. And so, in trying to put this new constitution into place, which is in a written form, and hopefully they'll be able to lay it down for all time so that it can't be breached again. The reason that that's taking place is quite often because a monarch has kind of pushed it too far, or not adhered to the previous principles, where previously everyone was sort of on the same page. And so the king would be, in prior times, viewing themselves as a protector of the kind of personal rights of the citizens, and then the negation of that is what creates the demand for the constitution.
Yeah, I assume that the Magna Carta is an example of that, where a king went too far and that he was actually bound by a constitution.
It's a little bit before the period that we're mainly focusing on, but yeah, you could probably look at it in that way. A better example would be the English Bill of Rights.
Yeah, it was basically there's a view of when we started to formalize some of these rights or some of these rules by putting pen to paper. it's now being viewed that was the beginning of this right or rule or whatever it may be. But it's actually just when it began to be formalized, because typically it was because a monarch had pushed things too far, and so they were being held to account to then formalize it, which in some ways, I can understand why it was being done at the time, and it's very hard to put yourself in the position of anyone going back 500 years or whatever it may be. But some of the formalizations that started to occur were the precursors to its own downfall. Does that make sense?
Yes. So this is where some of de Maistre comes in, because what he talks about is the process of turning an unwritten constitution into a written constitution is effectively its death. Is that the spirit of the constitution has already sort of passed, and now you're trying to nail it down and try to resurrect what it once was, but it's gone, and you can't really do that.
Yeah, it's like LARPing via regulation, or trying to put valor as like a legal precedent. Some of these things, some of these concepts that were being upheld and then were broken by the monarch, you can't reinstate by just writing down that it needs to occur again. These are not always things that go through the courts. These are attitudes, or these are embodiments of higher. They're hard to describe in law. I'm butchering my words here a bit because it's a little bit esoteric, but I think the whole concept of it being esoteric and then trying to put it and then trying to formalize it is where the issue comes in.
Yes. So Charles I and Louis XIV both considered themselves to be the guarantors of and many of their citizens also considered them to be the guarantors of the rights of their subjects. You can't legislate that. That's an attitude.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, you need to have some sort of all your legislation. It's in the UK. It's the same. They say the crown versus. So it's you've personified this into one person, and strictly this is a ceremonial role nowadays. But you just need somebody on the top who basically enforces this.
Yes. So there are certain systemic pressures that go into this, and that's probably why they had such a long string of rulers who would be thinking in this frame of, yes, I am the guarantor of my citizens' rights, and that they would too consider that. That requires a lot of stability of that attitude for that to be just kind of an accepted reality. So there probably is something pushing in that direction, but more to the point, you can't specifically write that down and expect it to be continued because you've written it down.
And you can see what happens when it comes to its logical conclusions now, when you have things like cognitive bias training and when they're trying to legislate on opinions or thought crime, essentially. That is where the Church of Reason leads you.
Or perhaps a better comparison would be when people are just kind of automatically making the assumption that because voters in particular are making the assumption that because you put somebody, because you voted somebody in, they are going to act according to the purposes of their role, not their own actual self-interest in reality. Because those are often very divergent things, where their own self-interest is going to lead them to make certain decisions that are, perhaps corrupt by an outside perspective, or even just focusing more on things like fundraising rather than the actual business of governing, and in return, trading favors and things for that, all of that kind of thing, rather than what their purpose actually is in theory, which is to represent the interests most purely of their constituents.
So nothing much has changed.
Well,
in the sense that we've lost the organic constitution. That phase has already passed, and so now we're in this new phase of.
So if I understand it correctly, then in the olden days you had a king, and that was tradition. So everybody would adhere to that. It's like an unwritten rule, but everybody would follow that rule.
Yeah.
And nowadays we have.
Sorry, go on.
we have formalized it, but still you have people with their own motives. And instead of that somebody inherits the throne, you now vote for a president or a prime minister for a couple of years, and he tries to do his thing. And maybe the biggest change is that a king might be concerned for things that happen to him and his children who would inherit the throne, while somebody who's elected is actually only concerned for the period he's elected for in the next election. So
yes, so in the kingdom you would have more focus towards I suppose organic aims and looking at things in that sense of the intergenerational aspect, like you said, like looking out for the interests of their own children and all of that kind of thing, which is going to lead to certain outcomes. But that's slightly separate, I think, to the written versus unwritten constitution side of this, where the written constitution is trying to tell everyone the same story of something that's already passed, because the organic constitution has already moved on. So we've suddenly got these two parallel constitutions almost, one that's dead and one that's living.
Yeah.
The other issue you get with formalization is when you start getting the weasels in the bureaucratic system come about. Once it's formalized, that's when you find the people that start picking apart a constitution and following the letter of the law as opposed to the spirit of the law. Once you actually applied it to, that's when loopholes are starting to be looked for. Whereas if you look at it more as an embodiment of as the state is something a little bit more, like I say, esoteric, where it's more of a sense of duty, it's more of a feeling or an attitude towards governance. Those kind of weaselly ways of getting out of written laws don't really apply, because it's why I've recently got some interest in cardinal sins, because they are intentionally vague, not as a way of over persecuting people, but as a way of you know when something is going against the spirit of a concept. It's just kind of an inherent feeling that you have that you can read into it, and you know when something is rejecting a certain concept. Anyway, kind of.
Yes, I agree, but I think it just manifests. So I think that personality disposition of being the weaselly type, let's say, that still manifests in both scenarios, but it manifests differently. So in terms of the weaselly type in an organic, like, living constitution setting, you get people who are just going to be much more firm is the wrong word, but dogmatic about their rights, about their traditional rights, and so they will probably be the type of people who are pushing for more of this sort of written, entrenched constitution style of doing things, because they want their rights set in stone, for all time. And those are the people who are looking very specifically about, like, what kind of extra rights can I pry out of this like living constitution that were enjoyed at some point in the past. And I think both sides, or perhaps even more than two, were looking at this setting and saying, like, how can I get the most out of this system while putting the least in? And you can kind of see that in one of the examples that's in the article, where the clergy are refusing to be taxed, and so instead the laity are taxed on their behalf.
I
when
agree.
It's supposed to be a tax that everybody was paying.
You're going to have that type of person in any system that you create. You're going to have those types of people, but I think I'd rather be in a system where they're the ones trying to form the constitution, as opposed to picking apart the constitution. But I think it's because there's a certain smugness that you have with it being a written constitution and then picking apart, and there's a high and mighty attitude that they have when someone manages to weasel their way out of written law. Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah.
Whereas if they're trying to put it to paper, and you have a strong tradition backing you up, this is the thing. They can only win if something breaks the tradition that you're already holding, because there's no incentive for people to write it down if everyone's following along fine and getting along fine, and everyone kind of knows it. And even if 99% of the people understand it inherently, and there's a small portion that don't, there's not enough of a rejection of that until there's something that breaks the tradition.
I think the sensitivity to some of those kinds of breaks, let's say, is going to be much greater, though, at certain points when you have a large number of these people around. So specifically, I'm thinking about things like, ship money and how that turns into a revolution where you're killing the king. That's pretty overblown when that could have been resolved at any number of levels lower than that. And I think that's partially just because you had such a large contingent of people who already wanted to, try and subvert the constitution and or being just completely dogmatic about what their rights were and not willing to bend to what were the requirements of the nation and the crown at the time.
We're discussing counterfactuals, aren't we? So it's hard to know.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, true.
I can understand where you're coming from, but I don't know if there are certain situations. But I don't know. I don't know.
That's fair.
And it's easy for me to stand here and say when I've got written into law so many things that can quote unquote protect my rights, and say that I wish for something that was more informal. And I don't know how you go. And this is moving off the essay slightly, but it is an interesting point to discuss. I don't know how you move from a formalized constitution to something less formal, because how do you return to a tradition when you've been so distanced from it? And how do you start a new one?
Yeah, you have to start doing the same thing over and over again, because tradition. Yes, you have to have a group movement that every year around the same time has the same party, and then if you do that a couple of years, it becomes a tradition. Because and it's the same for values, and you have to have books and literature about it, and it has to be something that is common knowledge that everybody just takes for granted. Because if it's something that everybody knows, then you really don't, and everybody values, then you don't really need to put it into a law. You don't need to write it down.
Well, this is the kind of riding the tiger, isn't it? You have to form yourself you have to work on yourself before you can work on the tradition. And once you've established that small tradition, then it kind of grows in the rubble of modernity. And I think it probably is a slow process, but it probably is the right answer.
It's not something you can fix immediately. It takes time. But there is a need within people for having regular things happening in their life, because it gives them a feeling of stability. So how distraught everybody was last Christmas when, due to the lockdown, you couldn't go get together with a family. That was horrible for people because they saw it as a tradition. I assume that there's some people who are happy that they didn't see their family, but I guess most people would have liked to see their family. So,
well, I'm sure there's probably some people that are happy that Christmas has been rejected by the state in a way. Cromwell is still alive and kicking with us.
Yeah, in that sense.
Anyway, we went on a good detour, but let's go back a little bit more on
let's circle back.
Yeah. One thing I didn't mention is the fact that, or one thing I mentioned very briefly, was that the prerogatives enjoyed by the French kings, say, versus other kings, like in England, is pretty close to one another. And in fact, in some ways, the English kings had more power than their French counterparts, or were expected to exercise more unilateral power. And so the question becomes, where did we get these perceptions from? And there's a couple of reasons for that given in the article. One of which being the Parliament in England is, we have a national parliament, basically, which makes it more of a high-profile institution compared to the sort of continental counterparts. And so what that meant was that, there was that kind of national body that became a sort of representative of a more bottom-up form of power, I suppose, that could be expressed in that centralized way. But also just because of the propaganda, essentially, that was surrounding the whole thing, and there was such an emphasis on trying to differentiate the sort of tyrannical and despotic French against the liberty-loving and free English.
Yeah, that sort of British exceptionalism when it comes to our history of loving liberty as opposed to the Continentals, it really has fallen away. It's something that it's one of the few historical myths that are still taught. Well, probably not anymore, because it's easier to remove any kind of way of glorifying your past, so they probably don't teach it anymore. But I know when I was growing up and learning any kind of history, it is taught that the British monarchy has always been more in favour of the individual, and it's not as collectivized as those damn European monarchs. And yeah, I think that I don't see any evidence of that.
Yeah, it's probably also reinforced by the fact that again, a lot of the writers who were commenting on this period in retrospect in the 19th century were doing so from under a Charles X or some other sort of Metternich era absolutist king that we never quite had in England. The closest that we had to that in Britain was merely a string of conservative governments that was just kind of ultimately destroyed by the repeal of the Corn Laws. But up until then, there was a little bit of a dominance of like more conservative landholders, but that's basically, that's nothing compared to the more reactionary monarchies of the continent at the time that were actively propping each other up and much more actively cracking down on free speech, free thought, and gatherings and all of that kind of thing, as is discussed in the article. So that's probably tinting our perceptions of the era again quite a bit, because we're retroactively applying that same worldview, I suppose, or that same dichotomy of Britain versus the continent that didn't necessarily exist in quite as stark terms earlier on.
Yes, and I think if we're talking about what were we saying? Say they were writing in the 1800s. There's a lot more unity on the continent, whereas if we're looking at a period, say they were discussing the 1400s. How the hell can you unify anything on the continent, and even unify anything on the British Isles as a way of dichotomy, as using them as a dichotomy? Because there are parts of England that are going to be close to Burgundy or whatever. That it doesn't make any sense. There's no unity. There's far less unity then than there is now. So trying to collectivize all of the mainland and use that as a way of boosting up the liberty-loving past of Britain just doesn't work.
Yeah,
it feels a bit like a myth or a fairy tale.
It feels a bit like America now.
Sorry?
It feels a bit like America now. The land of liberty, and everyone else, will be the world police of liberty kind of attitude.
In regards to the self-perception, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, America in particular has a very long history of that, and that was, one of the major founding myths, I suppose, of America, in that they were viewing England, because they were submitting to all of this tyranny and the despotic continental tendencies under their kings. They were viewing that as the end of the sort of civilizational cycle, I suppose, of Britain. Therefore, they needed to sort of cut themselves adrift to try and start the cycle anew. Yeah,
it probably comes from the same school of thought of trying to put heaven on earth kind of attitude when they went to make the new land over there. But anyway, were there any other points on that, or should we go on to some others that I've got listed here?
Yeah, I don't think I have anything else. I think everything that I've wanted to say has pretty much been covered now already, actually.
Yeah, we managed to, in that just random train of thought, managed to actually cover quite a lot of the points I've actually got. So that's quite impressive. Yeah, the quote that we have here, he kind of uses as an example in the essay, is the king is and ought to be absolute. That is so far absolute that there is no legal authority which can delay or resist him. And what he's saying in the article is that quote is kind of used as a way of saying, oh, look at how much more despotism and absolutism they have in the European state now, or the European monarchy now. But the point being made in the essay is this quote is not a new concept. This has been the mindset of every monarch, Europe-wide.
Well, apart from anything else, that's the one he deliberately misattributes, right? To
yes, so it's originally to Busset. I'm not sure.
Busset is how I've been pronouncing it, but probably mispronouncing it. I don't know.
But it's actually Blackstone, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Which I like that. Misattribute it to get them on board with the idea that it's this foreign concept, and then actually say no. One of the most English sounding names I could think of, Blackstone.
Yes, but so the idea that there is no authority above the king, and that the king ought to be able to conduct his will within the framework of his prerogatives as speedily and as decisively as he wishes. That's a universal idea. That's not something that's just strictly a factor of this this mystical absolutism that inhabits the realm of Louis XIV until it's overthrown by the French Republic. That's.
I actually don't think that it's absolute as they want to show. Because the will of the king might be absolute, but if none of his followers are willing to follow him, then nothing will happen. So if you remember Game of Thrones, you had a mad king there who wanted to burn down the city. So if you had a king who said, "Yeah, burn it all down," and none of his lieutenants want to do that, then basically it wouldn't happen. Napoleon had given much more orders to invade the United Kingdom than to invade Russia. But then in the end, they invaded Russia because nobody of his underlings wanted to go into the UK. They thought it was impossible. So they went for the easy option and they invaded Russia.
That point is made, and I think that even the quote kind of hints at that, is the fact that there's no legal authority which can delay or resist him. But if we're looking for examples, the first one that pops to mind is someone like Henry VI. There's not a legal authority. Ultimately, there was no legal authority. I know that things were used by Richard, but to take control of the throne briefly. But ultimately, once the legality is out the window, then it's just pure force, and it's who can amass the greatest force to reclaim the throne. It's exactly the same happened with Henry VII.
It's not even that. It's like the king can issue its will, but then the message, because a message has to be passed from person to person, because the king can't speak directly to everybody in his nation. And if this message is somehow delayed or lost, or is just left on a clerk's desk, which might happen, just lost in the bureaucracy, then it doesn't happen. So the bureaucracy actually can delay quite a lot of these things and reduce the effect the king has on the nation.
Yes, some of the accounts of Frederick the Great bring this across, actually, where he would take some tours of his lands, but everything would be sort of manipulated prior to his arrival to make things look very different to how they actually are. So everything would be repainted. Any derelict buildings would either have facades put up or be fixed up to a
kind of Potemkin villages.
Yeah, basically Potemkin villages all the way along until he's satisfied that he's seen that his lands are in order, and then everyone can go back to normal and live how they actually live. But that sort of brings across sometimes the futility, I suppose, of trying to create a bureaucracy like that, because that is less of a pressure when you're focusing your efforts on people that you have an inherent trust of. And so that's what brings in another feature of the article, in that the mechanisms of power become who can the king trust, and that becomes one of his most important tasks, is to surround himself with people who he can trust, which makes power a bit more feudal rather than trying to streamline and systematize everything in a bureaucracy where there can be, manipulation of procedural outcomes in that Potemkin village kind of way.
Mm-hmm.
You can't have people quite so readily inhabiting a position and staying there because of something that they've done, or just because they've existed so long in the bureaucracy. Rather, they deliberately have to go out of their way to try and make themselves seem trustworthy or to be trustworthy.
Yeah, any system you're going to encounter nepotism, because one of the greatest assets that people have to offer is their level of loyalty, and the best way to ensure that is to get people that are already on side, or at least that you can reliably assume are on side, and put them into positions of power.
Right, but hence the importance of some of these trusted regional power brokers is because they can interact with things as they actually are on the ground.
Yeah, they're like intermediary. Power brokers are a good way to do it, because in some ways they can be just on that Game of Thrones and using Game of Thrones as an example. Someone like the Spider is that kind of power broker who is a middleman who, in some ways, doesn't have any allegiances, and so but fulfills a function. So any monarch that steps up is going to be able to use that figure.
And you have to, because as a monarch, you're actually quite isolated from the rest. So basically, the court is your extension, and that's also a point that he's making. Although the monarch might be absolute, and the buck stops with him, so he can resolve issues, like the ultimate judge. He's not somebody who knows everything. So basically, the court exercises power and probably towards some regional people who control the region, especially when communication would take a long time, and they would actually run a province or some other smaller region of the realm, and maybe even more independently, like we would consider like provinces or regions nowadays. But when I come to think of it, the amount of control a central government has nowadays is much more than it would have back then, because back then it just would take time for information to travel across the land.
Well, anyone that disagrees with you, whilst we're currently all sat being told that we could be arrested for leaving our house in certain
by the prime minister, nonetheless. It's not that the mayor tells you this, or the sheriff, or the representative of your street or your suburb that you would normally talk to, or from some council. No, it's the prime minister. So he centrally exercises this power, and the state also touches a lot more aspects of your life nowadays, in contrast as it would back then, because back then you would have things like private armies and militias and things like that, and healthcare would have been done not by the state but by some other agency or by the church. So the nation state nowadays, the democratic nation state, feels like has its fingers in a lot more areas of your life than a absolute monarch would have in the 18th or 17th century.
Healthcare, actually, just on that previous point that we were talking about, when it comes to formalizing what would have been previous attitudes, healthcare is one of the ones that always comes to my mind, where it's not like people were left dying on the streets. That so much of people's healthcare needs were covered by institutions like the church or by charitable organizations. But because it's not guaranteed, because it's not written law, then that kind of formalization of saying, well, no, even though 99% of the time people are going to have these needs covered organically, because it's not a guarantee, that's where the issue lies. And I think that kind of enforcing something that's going to naturally occur anyway, that's when you mess with the natural. If it's happening organically, we may not know the incentives as to why it's happening, and we may not know why it's happening naturally. But once you enforce it, then you've disrupted what could actually be creating it. That's what I mean when I say that formalizing it is a way of leading it to its own destruction. And I'm sure
the NHS outcompetes any private healthcare institution.
Well, it outcompetes them because you're legally forced to pay for it.
Yes.
Well, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's less the competition aspect. To me, it's more that you've taken away the ability for anyone to privately fund it because they're being forced to pay into it, whereas they could previously.
But just if I remember correctly, you had like in the Victorian age, it was quite possible for somebody not to be in contact with the government his whole life.
Mhm.
Just so imagine that. So he never received a letter from the government, never had to talk to any government official. He just could lead his whole life without interacting with the government, because only people who had land and fortune would pay taxes. Or I think imports were also a big, but you didn't pay income tax and things like that. So and if you see how much you have to interact now with the government, then I would say, well, the amount of power that the government has over you has increased significantly. So how much power did an absolute monarch have over you? He couldn't condemn you to death. Like you have this like in Blackadder the second. You have that the queen says off with his head continuously, and that this probably wouldn't happen that often because it would make you very unpopular as a monarch.
Oh, the reverse actually quite often. That's the funny thing, is that a lot of the time, if the monarch came around, then he would be forgiving all sorts of criminals of their crimes. And so
because
that's one thing that a lot of local governments like to do, was that if they knew that the monarch was coming around, then they would quickly hurry to kill all the criminals that they had waiting for execution, because otherwise there was it was very likely that the king would commute all their sentences. Or
so this idea that there would be a monarch and that he would come over and kill you or prima nocta your wife or anything like that is it feels like, I doubt that happened a lot actually, because if you think about it, that if you would act like that as a monarch, how long would you be a monarch? People would start scheming against you. You would find poison in your food. They would get rid of you.
But this comes back to the point about the bureaucracies, because in some ways I'm not so sure that the power so in a lot of ways it obviously is more centralized, but in a lot of ways I think it's probably less so as well, because I question how much the individual leader of the country has, like how much ability they have to convert their will into actual action, because it's got to go through so many chains of bureaucracy where there are so many other opportunities for that the outcome to be manipulated.
Yeah, which was what I meant with the example of Napoleon and the UK.
Yeah,
I think it's more accurate to say the organisms or the organizations have grown, but yeah, the actual centralized power of that head of state have probably shrunk.
Yeah. So what's actually happened is that we've got this giant bureaucracy inhabiting something close to the center, but not quite the center, because we're all still focused on what the leader is saying, what the leader is doing, even though they may not even be necessarily voicing their actual mind or will. But that they are providing legitimacy to these other giant like bureaucratic organs who are in a lot of ways doing whatever they want, and if they feel like holding up certain policies and pushing through certain others, then really that's their ability is to do that. And because we're still, to bring this all the way back around again, because we're still stuck on these kind of dead constitutions, rather than focusing on the living constitution as it actually happens and as it actually exists, then we're not capable of seeing where the power is actually, where the negotiations are happening, where power is actually residing, and where decisions are actually being made.
And the thing that really tops it off with this kind of discussion is obviously speaking from a British point of view. Trying to talk about where power actually resides when we're talking about head of state is even more complicated because, I mean, obviously officially we have a head of state, but what can they actually do?
Theoretically, she can do everything.
This is the difference between a dead constitution and a living constitution. Because Britain, she can do whatever she wants. But can you imagine that actually being put into practice? I highly doubt it.
And in Belgium, not the current king, but his father, there was a law for abortion. So Belgium wanted to legalize abortion, and every law has to be signed by the king. And he, being a good Catholic, said, "I can't sign this law." So Belgium was a republic for one day, so they could pass this law, and then they made him king again. So then you know how this works basically. The role of the modern monarch is really ceremonial. They're there to cut ribbons and be there at the Olympic Games.
Well, unless you happen to live in Saudi Arabia or Oman or some
I would say that
Yeah.
the modern Western monarch. So, but I even doubt that in Saudi Arabia you have absolute power, because you still have a lot of tribalism going on.
Oh yeah, well, I mean, one of the big movements in Saudi Arabia at the moment is the current crown prince and his wielding of essentially what seems to be pretty absolute power. Despite not actually being king.
Yeah, but it's just being able to exercise it, and the rest is just a title.
Yeah.
It happened before that regents had more power than the actual king.
Indeed. Anything else that anyone else would like to cover then?
I'm just looking through. The only other thing that might be interesting to touch on briefly is when he mentions some of the lies that were spoken about absolute monarchy. One of them being how censorious they were. I just like the fact that he pokes fun at republics. Just saying that the majority of the republics at the time that you had what would be considered absolute monarchies and republics. The republic, obviously mainly Italy. I think it was Venice was the example of how it was.
He picked on Venice particularly.
Yeah, how it was censoring everything it get its hand on. And Geneva, I believe, was the other area where he mentioned was not a republic, but whatever system of government it wasn't a monarch, and they were also censoring.
Commune, I think it was the Commune of Geneva, I think.
Yes,
something like that. Right. Anyway, yeah, they were very, very repressive.
Just a question that's come in. Would we describe North Korea as a monarchy? What gives a certain family or lineage legitimacy if they're newly established?
Well, in the broadest technical sense, North Korea is a monarchy because it's ruled by one, power in the hands of one. But for my own part, I tend to make certain allowances, I suppose, for or draw a distinction between a monarchy that is beholden to some particular idea for its legitimacy versus a monarchy that's beholden to, well, no, I guess all are in some sense, but I suppose there's a difference, let's say, between a monarchy that is beholden to a religious conception of its own legitimacy, like a divine right, versus one that is more materialistically and, let's say, ideologically contingent, such as...
Do you want to discuss the unicorn cave?
The what?
The unicorn cave in North Korea, and the 17 holes in one that Kim Jong-il.
I always like the 17 holes. He allowed for one where he had a slip up and he didn't get a hole in one.
I'm not familiar.
Basically, in North Korea, the kings are there by divine right. So they're born and mounted. So if you just take Joseph Campbell's A Hero with 1,000 Faces, and you just read that, and then you look up the myths surrounding the Kim family, how they're all born and how they were able to read perfect Korean when they were 2 and things like that. Then it's like, yeah, they just copied that. So there's this whole creation mythos around it and divine right. So from that point of view, I would say actually that it is a monarchy. It's just they don't call themselves kings because they have some they started from a socialist revolution, so they can't use that term. But except for that, they do everything a quote unquote absolute monarch would do, including all the court intriges and disappearing sons and.
This may not be detailed enough, but I consider North Korea too modern to be what I would consider to be a monarchy, especially if you're coming off the back of the socialist revolution.
Why would that be different? Because they're modern. That's saying that history is over. Why couldn't a new monarchy?
No, that's not what I mean by modern. I mean modern as in modern as in the movement, not as in the time period. I think it goes more to that kind of materialistic mindset. And obviously that's going to always happen when it comes off the back of a socialist revolution. You're not going to get something immaterial from a socialist movement.
Well, so I bring up that particular the particular dichotomy that I made because I think people like the Big H fit into that category as well, because he was technically a monarch as well, but relying on a very to use your term, relying on a very modern sort of framing for his legitimacy. And so that creates some very different outcomes to, say, even a more contemporary monarchy, like, I don't know, the absolute monarchy in Morocco, fits into more of that older style.
Yeah, okay. Actually, your mention of the Big H, I think that's a way of trying to separate the two would be something closer to a dictatorship is a worship of the state itself and the head of that state, whereas a monarchy there is an exterior religious movement which may be tied into the monarchy, but it isn't a worship of the state itself. Does that make sense?
Yes, in most traditional monarchies, there's a perception of a higher power that is beyond the monarch, but it's not necessarily a temporal power. Whereas in some of these other monarchies, or some of these other dictatorships, let's say, the highest authority is considered to be either the state or the individual that is at the peak of the state.
Yeah, exactly. So even though the head of a monarchy is being endowed with the powers of the creator, or is a demigod in case of a pharaoh, there is always something one step above that. Whereas in a dictatorship, they are that's the end of the line.
Yeah, well, I guess this gets back to the other issue that we were talking about earlier, though, with regards to reliance on certain mindsets and ideas. So you have to live in a more traditional society where you have more traditional sort of spiritual perceptions being very widespread in order to have this not just become North Korea, perhaps.
Yeah, I've been thinking about. I think the term immaterial is really useful, more than spiritual, because it any kind of religious connotations that people aren't quite willing to get on board with. They're more like they can interpret better when you use the term immaterial. And it's a bit more universal.
I think the reason why you usually see religious things combined with monarchies is because then you have like a unwritten set of rules which everybody abides by. Because you don't need to write down that God has given this king his powers, because everybody knows that, nobody doubts it. So that makes the whole thing more stable. But I don't think it's a prerequisite of making a monarchy. It's making a more stable monarchy. But so from that point of view, I still think that North Korea would be a modern monarchy.
What do you think would differentiate a dictatorship and a monarchy?
I don't think those are dichotomies.
Okay. Well, okay.
So what would you say is the major difference between something like a North Korea and a Morocco, Oman, or Saudi Arabia, that are all absolute monarchies themselves, but obviously manifest very differently?
I think it's the amount of freedom that citizens enjoy, which is very low in North Korea, and it's higher in Morocco. So the monarchy itself is just a way to organize your government. It doesn't say how much power the government actually exercises on its subjects. If you look, for example, at Tsarist Russia, if there was one monarch who was divinely inspired, it would have been the Tsar. And still, all the gulags and things like that, the whole structure was set up during the Tsars. They weren't as effective as Stalin used it. But if you go to all the what's it, Tolstoy? No, it's Dostoevsky, for example. He was sent to a camp to work. Lenin was sent to a camp to work, and he just went home. So that whole system also existed. Well, the oppressive system also existed under a monarch. So
the chat has got some interesting comments going on, and there is another question I want to get back to. But this is an interesting point. It is would secession be the way of differentiating them? Is there a dictatorship that could pass on the head of state's hereditary?
I think it would be, but in order to be an effective dictator, you need to be crafty. And then the question is your son as crafty as you are? And are they craftier than everybody else around you? But once you've managed to do that, once you've established that it's hereditary, then it becomes easier. All monarchies have to start somewhere.
This goes to the other question that was asked: is what gives a new monarchy legitimacy?
The mob. It's just as long as most people say that he's the monarch, he's the monarch. That's
it's to do with the perceptions and the immaterial qualities that the monarch has been able to kind of create. So probably more like a story more than anything, I would say. So if the monarch is able to tell a compelling enough story about their own rise, let's say, and perhaps the wider national implications, then that would give them enough sort of legitimacy to carry forward on whatever metrics that they've claimed they are so successful on.
Yeah,
that's why I love Henry VII.
Yeah, well, it's kind of a bit of a nebulous answer in some ways, but I think it is kind of to do with.
It is
so Franco might be a good example.
Yeah, Franco would be an excellent example.
The easiest story is, of course, because my dad and his dad were king. So and that's a really easy story to tell.
Oh yeah, definitely.
But the harder one would be like, because I conquered all the realms and and everybody likes me, and but that's also, so if you, for example, if you look at the previous president of the United States, so he has a story and he has a lot of people that love him, and if he would proclaim himself king, then there would be people who would try to give legitimacy to that. And
Obama.
Or that, yeah. So
the previous president, right?
I'm not. I think we're on different timelines. So anyway.
So the legality argument is usually the go-to, but there can be some other things, some other stories in there. So another example might be the July monarch Louis Philippe, I think was his name, the Orleanist king in France from 1830 to 1848, where his claim was essentially that he was a monarch of the people, and he was there to sort of uphold the liberal principles that were carried from the French Revolution. So he was kind of the moderate candidate between the radicalism of the French Republicans and the restorationist tendencies of the French monarchists, who wanted to curb the excess, the worst excesses of the revolution. And that is itself a story that lends a certain amount of legitimacy, as well as the fact that he changed his own title from, he accepted the title of King of the French rather than King of France. Mm-hmm. Implying a certain amount of
what would you consider Idi Amin when it comes to changing titles? And is he a king, or was he a dictator?
I don't know enough about him, to be honest.
It's only because changing a title he's an absolute beauty when it comes to coming up with what was it, the lord of all of the African lands and the last king of Scotland. Oh, he referred to himself as the last king of Scotland, so I've answered it myself. Just carrying on the how they try and establish legitimacy question. There's also a tracing back of lineage beyond their father and the father's father. There's usually a tracing back of their lineage to basically a historic and semi-mythical character. That's usually done to establish some kind of bloodline of heroism.
Tracing back your lineage to Troy used to be the gold standard for that.
Yeah, and
who is Brutus of Britain, I think, was the one for here.
Okay. What else have we got? Someone said rule by one is a very loose definition of monarchy. That was Cyberwolf. I think that was kind of our point, is that can be used as a definition of monarchy, but it's not going to give you much information.
No, but in the same way that you could talk of democracy in terms of rule by the demos, rule by the people.
Exactly. I mean,
that's the frame in which I'm thinking.
Yeah, you might find it in the dictionary, but you're not really going to get anything out of it other than a very baseline definition. Space Cat Boy has said something that's going to be aimed mainly at you, Freelance.
Oh yeah.
just to stereotype you because you're out there on the continent. Actually, no, you're.
I'm isolated on the continent.
Yeah, I was going to say slightly adjacent to it.
Fork-gated channel, continent isolated.
Belgium is a weird example because the monarchy is the only thing holding together what people consider two distinct separate countries.
And it would be interesting to see if Flanders prefers the Dutch monarchy versus their own. Well, since I used to live in Belgium, and there's a cultural difference between the Netherlands and Flanders. Mm-hmm. Personally, and I'm gonna get a lot of flack for this from people from Belgium. I think that the people from the south of Belgium and the north of Belgium are actually not that different culturally. They just don't speak the same language. And that there's actually a lot of difference between the Dutch part of Belgium and the Netherlands. So they have a lot of things in common, the way that they live, the way the kind of way they do things. They don't, as far as I know, the monarchy in Belgium is not that popular. So they have like a Day of the King, and I believe it's the 14th of November or something like that. And nobody celebrates that. Everybody kind of ignores that. And if you go to the Netherlands, then when it's the king's birthday, then everybody is celebrating, and usually it's a big party, and you have like television, and they're really popular. So on the question who's more popular, they once did a test to see just a quiz who should be king of Belgium, and then the Dutch king actually won. And one of the reasons for that was that the wife of the Dutch king, he's married to a woman from Argentina. When she was proposed on television, she learned to speak Dutch in 3 months reasonably well. While the wife of the Belgian king, having lived in Belgium her whole life, doesn't speak Dutch. And this is something that really irritates the Dutch part of Belgium. So they said, how is it possible that he has a wife who lived in Belgium her whole life and she doesn't speak Dutch? While the Queen of the Netherlands learned to speak Dutch. It was from Argentina. Learned to speak Dutch in 3 months. So this instantly made her more popular in the north of Belgium. So it's. I think it also has to do a bit of like being how you can identify yourself with your monarch. If it's somebody who doesn't speak your language and refuses to and you can't talk to him and is not interested in what you do, then you won't be popular. While if the king seems to be somebody who's interested in what you do and might in his best grace even talk to you and able to talk to you, then people are just starstruck. So
this is one of the early drivers of Jacobite popularity as well, because the early Hanoverian Georges didn't speak English.
Yeah,
I think the first two.
And so the fact that the Dutch king and his family actually usually go to some village, and their kids play games with the other games. They have these really traditional games, and it's a bit silly, but it's a tradition that started after the Second World War, even before. And just have a day of the monarchy, and everybody dresses up in orange and things like that, and has the flags out. That's something that's really big in the Netherlands. So, and that's something you don't see in Belgium. But then again, I think that the Dutch are a bit insane, because when we ever play soccer, then everything goes orange as well. So,
Return of the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, perhaps.
When I was living in Belgium, I was accusing everybody of being rebel scum.
Good, as you should.
Also, when the Belgians were saying that, they said, well, yeah, Brexit is a shame. I said, well, I do want to remember you that in 1830 you had the Brexit when Belgium left the Union. And you're not complaining about that. You're not saying that you should return. And they were like, they kind of didn't have an answer, because they did exactly the same. They didn't want to be ruled by another union, a bigger union, so they became independent. And now the UK has done the same, and now they're complaining about it. So, like, rebel scum. Oh.
Good stuff.
Yeah.
Is that how we want to finish off?
I don't know. I know I'll never work in Belgium again.
I don't think I have any other comments to make. We had some good questions there. I like that. It was good to get some feedback and look into that. Yeah. Any other messages before we go?
I think that's pretty much it from me. I think we've covered
Yeah.
pretty thoroughly more or less everything in the article.
Yeah, everyone go read it because it was very informative and I thought it was very well written. I'm going to seek out more of this guy's stuff.
Or if you can't be bothered to read it, then head over to Rupert's library and have it read to you.
That is promotional gold. That was a fantastic way to
just
shill.
keep in the back of your mind that history is written by the victors, and
or the most effective rhetorician.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, history might be written by the victor, but 1,000 years in the future, which copy is going to be remaining is whichever one is.
Some live stream somebody dug up somewhere, and it's about 3 guys talking about a essay.
And how Belgium shouldn't exist.
Yeah,
that's the only remaining artifact of that essay. Enough.
Right. Yes. Goodbye. Goodbye.
All right,
I hope this isn't your only way of finding out about the article in 100 years' time.
We'll never know.